Phoebe Barrett was absolutely certain her life was perfectly calibrated until the moment she literally bumped into a man who would change everything. And when I say literally, it's because she spilled a glass of rosé wine on his impeccably white dress shirt while passionately discussing feminist perspectives on social media hypocrisy with her friend Rachel at the Reynolda House Museum of American Art in Winston-Salem. They were attending the quarterly Art and Innovation Mixer, where local entrepreneurs mingled with artists in what Phoebe cynically called the monthly parade of wealthy people pretending to understand culture. Oh my God, I'm so sorry. Phoebe rushed with napkins, her vintage emerald dress, a thrift store find she had expertly tailored, swishing as she moved. But she stopped mid-motion when her eyes met his. Green, intense and filled with a shyness that completely contrasted with the natural elegance of the man before her. He stood at least 6'2", with the kind of broad shoulders that suggested he did more than just sit behind a desk, yet there was something almost scholarly about the way he held himself. "Don't worry about it," he murmured, with a voice that carried traces of a refined southern accent mixed with genuine nervousness. These things happen at events like this. They were standing in front of the painting Human Touch, an abstract work by her late father that explored unexpected connections through vibrant brushstrokes in shades of Carolina blue and sunset gold. The piece was part of his acclaimed Tobacco Road Renaissance series, which had captured the transformation of North Carolina's industrial landscape into something more hopeful. The irony of the moment wasn't lost on Phoebe. Here she was, creating an unexpected connection of her own in front of her father's meditation on the very same theme. Julian Connor. Because yes, she would later discover this was the reclusive heir to Connor Naturals, the sustainable cosmetics empire that had quietly revolutionized the beauty industry from their Winston-Salem headquarters, observed the art with an almost scientific intensity. He seemed to be analyzing the interplay of pigments and texture rather than simply appreciating the emotional impact, his brow furrowed in concentration as if he were solving a complex equation. "Do you understand any of this colorful chaos?" asked Phoebe, attempting to break the ice while still clutching napkins soaked with wine and mortification. She gestured toward the painting with her free hand, noting how the museum's carefully controlled lighting brought out the subtle metallic threads her father had woven into the paint. Julian tilted his head, considering both her question and the artwork with equal seriousness. A slow smile spread across his features, not the practiced charm she'd learned to expect from men in expensive suits, but something genuinely thoughtful. "Well, from a technical standpoint, I believe your father was exploring how serendipitous moments can create profound bonds between people who might otherwise never cross paths. Notice how the colors maintain their distinct properties even as they blend, individual integrity within unity." "How profound," she retorted sarcastically, arching an eyebrow. And here I was, thinking it was just paint thrown on canvas to impress people with too much money and too little critical sense. Instead of being offended, he laughed, a genuine laugh that completely transformed his serious face, revealing a more human beauty behind the formal perfection. "You have an interesting way of seeing art, and you're probably right about people with too much money and their questionable motivations," says the man in a suit that costs more than my 3 months' rent, Phoebe observed. But there was playfulness in her voice, seasoned with genuine curiosity. "Touché." Julian extended his hand with a hesitant gesture. "Julian Connor, and you're right about the suit, but maybe you're wrong about my lack of critical sense. At least I hope you are." Phoebe Barrett, digital marketing consultant, professional skeptic of rich men in art galleries, and daughter of the artist whose work you were analyzing so seriously. Julian's face changed instantly. "Robert Barrett was your father? Wow. Sorry if I said something stupid about the work. Robert Barrett was one of North Carolina's most important artists. His work on sustainability and human connection greatly influenced my thinking about responsible business." Phoebe blinked, surprised. "You knew my father's work?" I have 3 of his pieces at home: Urban Roots, Cycles, and Sustainable Harmony. He could capture the essence of our region in a way that mixed social criticism with hope. Always inspired me. For a moment, Phoebe was speechless. It wasn't common to find people, especially wealthy men, who deeply knew her father's work. Most knew only superficially, out of social obligation. When their hands touched in greeting, Phoebe felt something she didn't expect, an electric current that ran through her arm and made her stomach flip. But this was out of the question. She had clear objectives, a career to build, and definitely didn't need masculine complications, especially the type who wore watches that cost more than a car and collected art from her own father. "Your father must have been a special person," Julian continued, and there was genuine reverence in his voice. The way he portrayed ordinary people from Winston-Salem, rural workers, entrepreneurial women, had a humanity I rarely see in contemporary art. "He was," Phoebe replied, feeling a pang of longing. "He died when I was 15, but left a worldview that still guides me." "I'm sorry. It must have been very difficult." "It was, but it also taught me that true art comes from authenticity, not from the need to impress." Julian looked at her with an intensity that made her feel seen in a way she hadn't experienced in a long time. "Maybe that's why you were so direct with me about the price of my suit." "Maybe," she admitted, smiling despite herself. Therefore, when Julian suggested having coffee to discuss more about art, social prejudices, and the legacy of visionary artists, she almost said no. Almost. But there was something in his eyes, a vulnerability hidden behind all that sophistication, a genuine reverence for her father's work, that made her hesitate. "Coffee," she agreed, surprising herself, "but ill choose the place. Nothing fancy with impossible-to-pronounce French names." "Perfect," he replied, and Phoebe realized she had just accepted the most dangerous invitation of her life. Because Julian Connor carried secrets that would make any woman question everything she thought she knew about rich men, power, and vulnerability. And Phoebe was about to discover that sometimes what we resist most is exactly what we need most. But it happened. Therefore, our professional skeptic was about to meet the most human side of a man who kept enough mysteries to turn her life upside down. 3 days later, Phoebe was still replaying their conversation while working on a digital strategy presentation for Mountain Heritage Crafts, a collective of Appalachian artisans who specialized in traditional pottery and textile work. Her downtown apartment, located in a converted tobacco warehouse in the Arts District, buzzed with the creative energy she'd cultivated since graduating from UNC Chapel Hill with dual degrees in marketing and art history. The exposed brick walls displayed a carefully curated mix of her father's smaller works and pieces from local artists she had championed through her consulting work. Pepper, her rescue cat, named after Virginia Woolf, because, as Phoebe often explained, she has the same intense gaze and unpredictable temperament, perched atop a vintage industrial bookshelf, conducting her daily surveillance of the neighborhood through the large factory windows. Phoebe found herself muttering about emotionally complex men who materialize out of nowhere with encyclopedic knowledge of your deceased father's artistic philosophy, much to Pepper's apparent disdain. "I'm not remotely interested in him, Pepper," she declared to her feline audience, who responded with a deliberately slow blink that somehow conveyed profound skepticism. "Seriously, zero attraction. He represents everything I've spent years avoiding: inherited wealth, social privilege, and the kind of complications that come with dating someone whose family probably owns half of Forsyth County." The irony wasn't lost on her. Here was Phoebe Barrett, the woman who'd built her career championing economic equality and authentic brand storytelling, fantasizing about a man whose trust fund probably exceeded the GDP of small nations. A man who'd quoted her father's artistic manifesto as if he'd memorized it for personal inspiration rather than social media brownie points. Her contemplation was interrupted by the distinctive ringtone Shed assigned to Marcus Washington, her best friend since their undergraduate days at Wake Forest. Marcus had parlayed his theatre major and natural charisma into becoming Winston-Salem's most sought-after makeup artist and image consultant, with a client roster that included everyone from local news anchors to the wives of tobacco company executives. More importantly, he possessed an uncanny ability to extract information from the most unlikely sources, making him the city's unofficial intelligence network wrapped in designer clothing and witty commentary. Girl, cancel whatever you're doing and prepare yourself for some premium gossip about your mysterious art gallery prince, Marcus announced without preamble, his voice carrying that particular tone that meant he'd struck conversational gold. And before you even think about denying your interest, Emma already told me you've been humming while organizing client files, which hasn't happened since your breakup with that pretentious photographer 3 years ago. Hair's not my prince, and my sister needs to stop psychoanalyzing my behavioral patterns like I'm her graduate thesis subject, Phoebe protested, though she could feel the heat rising in her cheeks. Emma, a clinical psychology PhD candidate at Duke, had always been uncomfortably perceptive about Phoebe's emotional states. Also, humming is a perfectly normal response to productive workflow, thank you very much. And I suppose your sudden interest in sustainable business practices is purely coincidental. Because I distinctly remember you Googling Connor Natural's environmental impact yesterday when you thought I wasn't looking. Marcus chuckled, the sound rich with satisfaction. Honey, Winston-Salem might be growing, but it's still small enough that interesting people create ripples. Julian Connor is the enigmatic heir to Connor Naturals. You know, that sustainable cosmetics empire that's been quietly disrupting the beauty industry while everyone else was still figuring out how to pronounce biodegradable. Their Real Beauty campaign last year, featuring unretouched photos of actual women from the Piedmont region, that was his brainchild. Phoebe nearly choked on her fair trade coffee. Connor Naturals? The company behind those incredible before and after campaigns that went viral for celebrating natural aging and diverse beauty standards. The very same. But here's where it gets interesting, darling. Word on the street, and by street, I mean the impeccably reliable gossip network that runs through Meredith's salon, where all the society wives get their highlights, is that Julian Connor is somewhat of a beautiful mystery. Brilliant, but reclusive, passionate about environmental science, but terrified of board meetings, the kind of man who can revolutionize an industry from behind the scenes, but breaks into nervous sweats at cocktail parties. That's oddly specific intelligence. My client, Mrs. Henderson, sits on the hospital board with his mother, Grace Connor. Apparently, Julian has a reputation for being what the society ladies diplomatically call academically gifted but socially selective. Translation, he's incredibly smart, but prefers the company of his research books and prize-winning honeybees to most human beings. Prize-winning honeybees? Phoebe's voice pitched higher despite her attempts at nonchalance. That's either incredibly charming or mildly concerning. Oh, it gets better. Apparently he's something of a prodigy when it comes to sustainable apiculture. His operation supplies organic honey to half the farm-to-table restaurants in the Triad, and he's published papers on native pollinator conservation. The man is literally saving the local ecosystem one bee colony at a time, while simultaneously creating cosmetics that don't destroy the environment. It's like he's too good to be true, which naturally makes me suspicious of his motives. Before Phoebe could fully process this information overload, her phone buzzed with an incoming call from an unfamiliar number with a local area code. Hold that thought, Marcus. I've got another call. This better not be you trying to escape this conversation, because I'm just getting to the good parts about his family drama and why he never dates anyone. Phoebe switched lines, her curiosity now thoroughly piqued despite her better judgment. Hello, Phoebe, this is Julian Connor. I hope you don't mind the intrusion. I got your number from Sarah Mitchell at the museum. His voice carried that same thoughtful cadence she remembered, though now it seemed layered with nervous energy. I wanted to follow up on our conversation about art and, well, perhaps expand it into something more professionally relevant. Phoebe gestured frantically for Marcus to stay quiet as she switched to speakerphone, though he immediately began making exaggerated facial expressions that somehow managed to convey both encouragement and mischief. "Not at all," she replied, surprised by how genuine she sounded. "How can I help you?" "I've been reviewing your digital portfolio since our meeting. Your work with the Appalachian Artisan Collective particularly caught my attention. The way you managed to increase their market reach while maintaining the authenticity of their traditional craftsmanship was impressive." There was a pause, filled with what sounded like papers rustling and possibly pacing. "I'm currently developing a new product line for Connor Naturals, something that would democratize access to quality beauty products while supporting local suppliers and maintaining environmental standards. I could use a consultant who understands both digital marketing and the delicate balance between commercial success and cultural integrity." Phoebe felt Marcus grab her arm with barely contained excitement, his eyes widening as he mouthed, "Holy shit, he's offering you work with a Fortune 500 company." She waved him away, trying to focus on Julian's proposal. "You're offering me a consulting position. I'm suggesting a professional collaboration with the potential for it to develop into something more substantial if our approaches align." His voice carried that careful precision she was beginning to recognize as characteristic of how he spoke when nervous. "I value outside perspectives, particularly from someone who clearly isn't afraid to challenge conventional thinking." And another hesitation. "I'd genuinely like to learn more about your father's artistic philosophy and how it might inform ethical business practices." The mention of her father created an unexpected warmth in her chest. Most people reference Robert Barrett's work as a polite conversation starter, but Julian spoke about it with the kind of reverence usually reserved for discussing profound personal influences. There was an honesty in his voice that disarmed all of Phoebe's carefully constructed defenses. Men like him, at least the ones she knew, didn't usually admit they needed to learn something, much less from a freelance consultant who worked from her own apartment. "Where and when?" she asked, ignoring Marcus' increasingly animated gestures, who was practically jumping with curiosity. "How about tomorrow afternoon? I can pick you up, or if you prefer—" "No need. Send me the address and he'll drive." After arranging the details, he lived on the outskirts, in a rural area of Winston-Salem that she knew only in passing. Phoebe hung up and found herself facing Marcus, practically bouncing with contained curiosity. "You're going to work for him?" "I'm going to talk about work. It's different." "Phoebe, you realize this could be more than work, right? The guy called you specifically, mentioned your father, praised your work. This isn't coincidence." "Please, Marcus. I'm a serious professional. I don't mix work with other things. Other things like the first genuine attraction you felt for someone in how long? 2 years. 3, Phoebe admitted, before realizing she had completely given herself away. Marcus smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had just won a bet with themselves. "There. Now that you've admitted it, you can relax and see what happens." But as she prepared for sleep that night, Phoebe admitted to herself that there was something about Julian Connor that awakened not just her professional curiosity, but a personal restlessness she hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't just the wealth or mystery. It was the way he looked at her, as if he really saw her. Not just a consultant or a pretty woman, but a complete person with valid opinions and an interesting story. It was the genuine reverence with which he spoke of her father, as if he understood that art isn't decoration, but transformation. Therefore, when she fell asleep, she dreamed of green eyes, golden bees, and conversations about sustainability. But she woke up remembering that rich men always had ulterior motives, even when those motives seemed surprisingly sincere. However, sometimes ulterior motives can be more honest than first impressions. Julian's estate existed in a completely different ecosystem than anything Phoebe had expected from a cosmetics industry heir. Located 15 minutes outside Winston-Salem proper, the property sprawled across 43 acres of reclaimed farmland, where tobacco fields had been transformed into wildflower meadows, organic gardens, and carefully maintained woodland trails. The house itself was a marvel of sustainable architecture, a modern structure that seemed to grow organically from the landscape, with extensive use of reclaimed wood, solar arrays that looked more like sculptural installations than utilitarian additions, and a living roof system that supported native grasses and wildflowers. This is like discovering a secret, sustainable paradise that just happens to have a billionaire's son living in it, Phoebe murmured as she parked her elderly Honda Civic next to what she was fairly certain was a Tesla, though it was so covered in pollen and what looked like bee-related equipment that its exact make was difficult to determine. Julian emerged from the house before she'd even turned off her engine, wearing worn Levi's that had clearly seen actual work, a faded Wake Forest University t-shirt, and work boots that showed evidence of regular outdoor use. His hair was slightly mussed, as if he'd been running his hands through it, and there was something endearingly awkward about the way he hovered near her car, clearly wanting to help, but uncertain about the social protocols of greeting a female business consultant at his private residence. "I hope the drive wasn't too difficult to find," he said, as she gathered her materials from the back seat. "GPS systems sometimes get confused by our private road, and I realized after we spoke that I should have offered more detailed directions. Your directions were perfect, though I'll admit I was wondering if I'd accidentally stumbled into some kind of environmental research facility." She gestured toward the impressive gardens visible from the driveway. "This doesn't exactly match the stereotype of how cosmetics industry heirs typically live." A genuine smile transformed his features, erasing some of the nervous tension she'd noticed. "Most people expect something more ostentatious. My brother Connor has a penthouse in Charlotte with a wine cellar worth more than most people's houses. I prefer this." "Why bees?" she asked, as they walked toward what appeared to be a series of wooden structures nestled among flowering trees. "I mean, of all the possible hobbies for someone in your position, apiculture seems remarkably specific." Julian's expression grew more animated, the way people look when discussing something they genuinely love rather than something they feel obligated to discuss. "It started during my graduate work at NC State. I was studying sustainable chemistry and became fascinated by how bee colonies operate as perfect examples of efficient, waste-free societies. Every individual has a role, nothing is wasted, and the entire system works in harmony with the broader ecosystem." He paused near one of the hives, his voice taking on the quality of someone sharing something deeply personal. "When I came back to Winston-Salem to join the family business, I was struggling with how to balance profit motives with environmental responsibility. Watching the bees taught me that it's possible to be both productive and sustainable, both individual and collaborative." "That's," Phoebe paused, struck by the thoughtfulness of his answer, "actually profound. And completely unexpected from someone whose family built an empire on convincing people they need products to be beautiful. Which is exactly why I want to change how we operate." He gestured toward the house, where she could now see large windows revealing what appeared to be a laboratory or workshop space. "The beauty industry has spent decades creating insecurities to sell solutions. I want to flip that model. Create products that enhance rather than correct, that celebrate diversity rather than enforce conformity." As they walked toward the house, Phoebe found herself studying Julian with growing curiosity. There was something compelling about the way he moved through his environment, confident and purposeful among his gardens and research spaces, yet she remembered how reserved he'd seemed at the museum. It was as if he had two distinct modes: the private man who spoke passionately about ecological systems and social responsibility, and the public figure who seemed uncomfortable in his own skin. "Tell me about this new product line," she said as they entered his home office, which was unlike any corporate workspace she'd ever seen. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the bee colonies. Bookshelves were filled with everything from technical journals on sustainable chemistry to philosophy texts and what appeared to be original poetry collections. A baby grand piano occupied one corner, with sheet music scattered across its surface. "You compose?" she asked, noticing handwritten musical notations alongside what appeared to be chemical formulas and business projections. Julian followed her gaze and colored slightly. "It's just something I do when I need to process complex problems. Music and chemistry have more in common than people realize. Both involve understanding how different elements interact to create something harmonious." He moved to his desk, clearly eager to redirect the conversation towards safer professional territory. "The product line I'm developing is called Essence. The concept is to create high-quality, affordable beauty products using ingredients sourced directly from North Carolina farmers and artisans." Phoebe settled into a chair across from his desk, noting how the afternoon light streaming through the windows seemed to highlight the intensity in his green eyes. "Affordable how? Because affordable luxury usually means expensive products with good marketing. Truly affordable. Products that a single mother working 2 jobs can purchase without sacrificing groceries. Products that a college student can buy without choosing between skincare and textbooks." Julian opened a comprehensive folder that appeared to contain months of research. "I've been working with agricultural economists at NC State to develop supply chains that bypass traditional cosmetics industry markups. Direct partnerships with local honey producers, herb farmers, and even textile workers who can create sustainable packaging." As Phoebe reviewed the documentation, her professional skepticism began giving way to genuine admiration. This wasn't some feel-good corporate social responsibility initiative designed to generate positive press. Julian had clearly spent considerable time and resources developing a business model that could actually disrupt the traditional cosmetics industry while supporting local economies. "This is incredibly thorough," she said, looking up from a detailed analysis of consumer purchasing patterns among women earning less than $35,000 annually. "But it's also incredibly ambitious. You're essentially proposing to compete with established brands that have billion-dollar marketing budgets and decades of market penetration. Which is exactly why I need someone who understands how to build authentic connections with consumers who've been ignored or exploited by traditional beauty marketing." Julian leaned forward, his earlier nervousness replaced by passionate conviction. "Your work with the Appalachian Artisan Collective showed me that you understand how to honor traditional values while embracing modern platforms. You didn't try to make mountain craftspeople conform to urban aesthetic preferences. You helped urban consumers appreciate the inherent value of traditional craftsmanship. And you think that approach would work for cosmetics? I think women are tired of being told they need to fix themselves. I think they're ready for products that celebrate who they already are." Julian's voice carried a conviction that surprised her with its intensity. "My mother has spent 40 years using products that promise to make her look younger, thinner, more acceptable. She's a brilliant woman who speaks 3 languages and serves on the boards of 2 major non-profits. But she starts every day by applying products designed to hide her natural appearance." The personal revelation hung in the air between them, creating an unexpected intimacy that made Phoebe acutely aware of how alone they were in his beautifully appointed office. She found herself studying the strong line of his jaw, the way his hands moved expressively when he spoke about subjects that mattered to him, the genuine pain in his eyes when he mentioned his mother's relationship with beauty standards. "And does your family support all this idealism?" Julian's face closed slightly, like a door shutting. "My mother, Grace, thinks it's a phase. Youthful idealism were her exact words. My brother Connor considers it a waste of time and potential profit. He prefers to keep the focus on premium products for the elite. Only my father shows some interest, but he's somewhat absent lately." "Absent how?" "Health problems, complex family issues. He's always been more open to change, But now he's withdrawing more and more. And you? What do you really think about all this? I think if I don't do this, I'll feel like a hypocrite for the rest of my life. I have access to resources, knowledge, technology. If I don't use this to create something that really matters, what's the point of everything? The brutal sincerity touched something deep in Phoebe. There was a vulnerability in Julian that drastically contrasted with his privileged position, a search for purpose she recognized in herself. It was like looking in a mirror and seeing someone who shared the same existential restlessness, the same need to make a real difference. "I need to ask you something," she said, closing the dossier and facing him directly. "Why me? There are huge agencies, famous consultants, people with much more experience who would kill for this project." Julian hesitated, running his hand through his hair in a gesture that revealed nervousness. "Because you didn't try to impress me at the gallery. On the contrary, you were completely honest about what you thought, even knowing I could be a potential client. And because..." He stopped, blushing again. Because when you speak, it seems like you're saying exactly what you think, not what you think I want to hear. That's rare in my world." "And why else?" He looked at her, surprised. "What do you mean?" "Julian, I'm good at what I do, but I'm not the only competent consultant in Winston-Salem. There's something else that made you call me specifically." He was quiet for a long moment, as if deciding how much to reveal. "Because I researched your work after the gallery. The campaign for the Artisans Cooperative wasn't just marketing. You created a platform that really changed those women's lives. And because..." He hesitated again. "Because you understand that art and business can work together without one nullifying the other. Your father achieved that, and you inherited that vision." Phoebe felt her heart accelerate. "How do you mean my father achieved that?" "Robert Barrett didn't just paint about sustainability and social justice. He sold his works to finance community projects, created free art workshops for underprivileged youth, used his art as a tool for real transformation. He united purpose and financial sustainability in a way that always inspired me." "You really knew his work." "I knew and admire it. When I found out you were his daughter, I thought, if she inherited even half of her father's vision, she can help me do this right." In that moment, with the afternoon sun entering through the large windows and Julian looking at her with a mixture of genuine hope and vulnerability, Phoebe realized she was in completely unknown territory. It wasn't just about work. It was about two people who recognized each other in some inexplicable way, who shared deep values disguised as professional conversation. "All right," she said, extending her hand with a smile she couldn't contain. "Let's make this partnership work, but with one condition." "What?" "Total honesty, in business and everything else." When he shook her hand, holding it for a few seconds longer than necessary, Phoebe knew she had just accepted much more than a professional project. She had just accepted an adventure that would test all her convictions about independence, relationships, and what really mattered in life. But it happened. Therefore, now it was too late to go back, even if she wanted to. And secretly, she didn't want to go back at all. 2 weeks into their professional collaboration, Phoebe had developed a fascinating routine that involved driving out to Julian's estate 3 times a week, ostensibly to work on marketing strategies for the Essence line, but increasingly to engage in conversations that ranged far beyond business parameters. She'd discovered that Julian Connor was a man of intriguing contradictions, brilliant but self-deprecating, passionate about social justice but terrified of cocktail party small talk, and possessed of an almost encyclopedic knowledge about subjects ranging from sustainable agriculture to classical music composition. She had also become acquainted with Dorothy Hayes, Julian's housekeeper and unofficial surrogate mother, who had worked for the Connor family since Julian was 12 years old. Dorothy was a formidable woman in her 60s who had raised 3 children of her own while managing the Connor household, and who seemed to view Julian's emotional well-being as her personal responsibility. She made exceptional sweet tea, baked legendary bourbon pecan cookies, and had an unsettling ability to appear with refreshments at precisely the moments when Phoebe and Julian's conversations were becoming most interesting. "That boy's been different since you started coming around," Dorothy had confided during one of these strategically timed interruptions, setting down a tray of cookies that were still warm from the oven. Smiling more, staying up late working on those music compositions of his, actually eating regular meals instead of forgetting to feed himself when he gets absorbed in his research projects. Today, however, their usual work session had taken an unexpectedly personal turn when Julian had made an offhand comment about his family's expectations for his role in the company, leading to a conversation that revealed layers of complexity Phoebe hadn't anticipated. "The thing about growing up as the heir apparent to a family business," Julian was explaining as they reviewed consumer survey data, "is that everyone assumes you're automatically suited for leadership just because you understand the product development side of the operation. But understanding sustainable chemistry doesn't necessarily translate into being comfortable with boardroom politics or investor presentations. You seem perfectly articulate when you're talking about subjects you care about," Phoebe observed, noting how animated he became when discussing the technical aspects of their project. "Maybe the problem isn't your communication skills. Maybe it's that you're being asked to communicate about things that don't genuinely interest you." "That's—" Julian paused, considering her words with the same careful attention he brought to everything else. "Actually, that's probably accurate. When Connor gives presentations to potential investors, he speaks fluently about market penetration and profit margins and competitive advantages. When I try to give the same presentations, I find myself wanting to talk about environmental impact and worker welfare and whether we're actually making people's lives better. Different values, different languages," Phoebe said. "Your brother speaks business, you speak purpose. Which would be fine if purpose paid the bills and kept shareholders happy." "Who says it can't do both?" Phoebe challenged. "Some of the most successful companies of the last decade have been built around purpose-driven missions. Patagonia, Ben & Jerry's, The Body Shop. Consumers increasingly want to support brands that align with their values." Julian looked at her with an expression that was becoming familiar, a mixture of hope and skepticism that suggested he wanted to believe her but had been disappointed before. "You really think it's possible to build a successful business around ethical principles without compromising either the ethics or the success?" "I think it's not only possible, but inevitable. The question is whether Connor Naturals wants to be ahead of that curve or behind it." Phoebe laughed, a sound that echoed through the spacious office. "Do you really want to know, or are you trying to understand why someone would choose precarious independence over corporate security?" "Both. And maybe trying to understand if it's possible to be successful without giving up one's own values. My father was a visual artist. Robert Barrett, you already know. He lived for art, never worried about money, stability, or social approval. My mother, Helen, a practical nurse with her feet on the ground, lived desperate, wanting him to get a real job." Phoebe made air quotes, imitating her mother's voice. "They constantly fought about it. He said art was a calling. She said calling doesn't pay the electric bill." And who was right? Both, in different ways. After he died when I was 15, my mother had to work double to support the house. I swore I'd never depend on anyone for anything, that I'd be financially and emotionally independent, but I also swore I wouldn't give up my values to achieve that. And did it work? So far. I'm not rich, but I pay my bills doing work I believe in. "And you?" Phoebe leaned forward, studying his face. "Why do you hide in this ecological mansion instead of being out there commanding the family empire?" Julian was quiet for a long moment, playing with a pen as if it were the most fascinating thing in the world. "Because out there people want things from me that I don't know if I can give." "What kind of things?" "Social confidence, charismatic leadership, the ability to be in a room full of people without wanting to run away. Superficial networking, Fake smiles, the skill to make small talk about subjects that don't interest me with people who don't matter to me. The brutally honest confession disarmed all of Phoebe's carefully constructed defenses. Do you have social phobia? Among other things, social anxiety to be more precise. Ironic, isn't it? The heir to a beauty company who can barely speak in public without breaking into a cold sweat. Hey, she said, gently touching his arm, feeling the muscle tension there. You're talking to me now, and very well, I might add. With you it's different. Why? Because you don't expect anything from me except honesty. You don't want me to be charming, politically correct, or impressive. You want me to be real. And does that scare you or relieve you? Both, he admitted, looking directly into her eyes for the first time in the conversation. It scares me because it's vulnerability, and it relieves me because it's freedom. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Pepper, who had begun accompanying Phoebe to the estate after demonstrating an alarming ability to escape from her downtown apartment whenever left alone for extended periods. Pepper had quickly established herself as the unofficial supervisor of their work sessions, conducting thorough inspections of Julian's office, claiming the prime sunny spot near the window, and occasionally offering editorial commentary by walking across important documents when she felt they were receiving insufficient attention. Your cat has opinions about our marketing strategy, Julian observed, as Pepper deliberately positioned herself on top of their consumer demographic charts, fixing them both with a stare that somehow managed to convey both disdain and protective concern. Pepper has opinions about everything. She's like a furry life coach with boundary issues. Phoebe gently relocated her cat to a nearby chair, where Pepper continued to observe their work with the intensity of a quality control supervisor. She's actually a pretty good judge of character, though. She usually hides from people she doesn't trust. And she doesn't hide from me. She literally claimed your piano bench as her personal throne the second day we were here. That's basically a feline endorsement of your character. Julian smiled, and Phoebe noticed how the expression transformed his entire face, softening the angular lines and bringing warmth to his green eyes. I'm honored by her approval. You should be. Pepper's standards are impossibly high. She once refused to acknowledge a guy I dated for 3 months because he wore cologne she found objectionable. What happened to cologne guy? Turned out he was cheating with his ex-girlfriend. Pepper knew something was off weeks before I figured it out. Phoebe settled back into her chair, surprised by how easy this conversation felt. She has excellent instincts about people who aren't being entirely honest. The comment hung in the air between them, creating a moment of charged silence that made Phoebe acutely aware of the shift in their relationship from purely professional to something more complex and potentially dangerous to her carefully maintained emotional equilibrium. Phoebe, Julian said quietly, his voice carrying a quality she hadn't heard before, vulnerable but determined. I need to tell you something that might complicate our working relationship. More complicated than developing feelings for your business consultant. He looked startled. You've developed feelings for me? I asked first. Julian laughed, a sound that seemed to surprise him as much as it pleased her. Fair enough. Yes, I've developed feelings that go considerably beyond professional appreciation for your marketing expertise. And yes, I'm aware that pursuing those feelings could potentially compromise the success of our project, damage my company's relationship with your consulting firm, and generally create the kind of personal professional boundary violations that appear in human resources training videos as examples of what not to do. Those are some impressive rationalizations for avoiding emotional risk. I prefer to think of them as thoughtful considerations of potential consequences. Julian. Yes? You're overthinking this. He smiled, and for the first time since they met, Phoebe saw in him not the reserved businessman or privileged heir, but the vulnerable and intelligent man who hid behind all that forced sophistication. So, would you like to try? Phoebe felt her heart beat faster. There was something about Julian that awakened not just her professional interest, but an intense personal curiosity she hadn't experienced in years. It was the combination of intelligence, vulnerability, and principles that attracted her irresistibly. "One try," she agreed, surprising herself, "but with clear rules." "What rules?" "First, work is work. We don't mix project with personal relationship. Second, no emotional games. Third, if it doesn't work, we end it like civilized adults without harming the project. And fourth, there is no fourth, yet." Julian smiled, and for the first time, Phoebe saw genuine confidence replacing the usual insecurity. "So," he said, extending his hand again, "partners on all fronts." "Partners," she agreed, shaking his hand and knowing she had just crossed a line that would change everything. But it happened. Therefore now she would have to discover if mixing business with genuine attraction was the best or worst decision of her life. And secretly, she was anxious to find out. 6 weeks into what had evolved from a professional consultation into something that defied easy categorization, Phoebe discovered that being romantically involved with Julian Connor was like learning to speak an entirely new emotional dialect. He communicated affection through thoughtful gestures that revealed how carefully he paid attention to her preferences. Her favorite fair trade coffee appearing in his kitchen before her arrival. Books by authors she'd mentioned in passing, left on her car windshield with handwritten notes explaining why particular passages had reminded him of their conversations, and a seemingly inexhaustible patience with her fierce independence that sometimes manifested as reflexive rejection of anything that could be construed as traditional relationship expectations. "You realize you don't have to insist on splitting every dinner check to prove your feminist credentials," he said gently as they walked through downtown Winston-Salem after sharing a meal at the Catherine Brasserie, a farm-to-table restaurant she'd selected specifically because it sourced ingredients from the same local suppliers they were considering for the Essence line. "It's not about feminist credentials. It's about maintaining financial autonomy and avoiding the unconscious power dynamics that develop when one person consistently pays for shared experiences. What if I told you that I genuinely enjoy being able to treat someone I care about to nice experiences, not as a display of financial power, but simply because giving you pleasure gives me pleasure?" I'd say that's a lovely sentiment that doesn't address the systemic issues inherent in traditional dating models, where men's financial contributions are expected and women's are seen as unnecessary or even emasculating. Julian stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression serious but amused. "Phoebe, I grew up in a family where money was used as a weapon, where love was contingent on financial performance, and where relationships were essentially business transactions with romantic window dressing. The absolute last thing I would ever want is to recreate those dynamics with someone I care about." "Then why does it matter to you who pays for dinner?" "Because when I was younger, before my family dysfunction became impossible to ignore, my grandfather taught me that taking care of people you love is one of the fundamental ways humans express affection. Not taking care of them in a paternalistic, controlling way, but taking care of them in the sense of wanting to contribute to their happiness and well-being." Julian's voice carried a vulnerability that made her chest tighten. "And because I'm falling in love with you, and I want to express that love in ways that feel natural and genuine to me." The word love dropped into their conversation like a stone into still water, creating ripples that seemed to expand outward into every aspect of their relationship. Phoebe felt her carefully constructed emotional defenses begin to shift and reorganize themselves around this new reality. "You're falling in love with me?" she asked, her voice softer than she'd intended. Julian's face flushed, but he didn't look away. "I'm past falling, actually. I'm fairly certain I've landed, Julian. And I realize that complicates everything we've been building professionally, and I know it probably seems presumptuous given that we've only been seeing each other for a few weeks, but I've never felt this way about anyone before, and I thought you should know where I stand emotionally so you can make informed decisions about where you want this relationship to go." You've never felt this way about anyone before? Never, not even close. Phoebe studied his face, noting the earnest vulnerability in his green eyes, the way his hands moved restlessly, as if he wanted to reach for her but wasn't sure whether such contact would be welcome. There was something almost heartbreaking about his honesty, about the careful way he was offering her his feelings while simultaneously trying to protect her right to reject them without pressure or consequence. But I need you to understand that loving me means accepting that I'm going to challenge you, argue with you, and occasionally drive you absolutely crazy with my need to maintain independence, even when it's impractical or unnecessary. I'm counting on it. And I need you to understand that I come with family complications, financial limitations, and a rescue cat who will judge every decision you make for the rest of your life. Pepper and I have already established a mutual respect. Agreement. I'm falling in love with you too, she said quietly, watching his expression transform from nervous hope to something approaching joy. I think we'll be fine. When Julian kissed her, there on 4th Street with the historic buildings creating a backdrop that seemed designed for romantic revelations, Phoebe felt something fundamental shift in her understanding of what she wanted from her life. This wasn't just attraction or even deep affection. This was the recognition of finding someone who saw her completely and chose to love what he saw, complexities and contradictions included. The smile that spread across his face was like sunshine after a storm, completely transforming his expression. He pulled her closer, touching his forehead to hers with a tenderness that made Phoebe wonder how she had lived so long without this. Are you sure? Because loving a man with social anxiety who raises bees, plays piano in secret, and has a complicated family can be challenging. I'm sure. But are you sure you want to love a stubborn woman who argues for sport, has a cat that judges all your decisions, and comes with a family that will analyze you like you're a rare specimen? Absolutely sure. When they kissed, there in the middle of Winston-Salem's historic square, with the old lights creating an almost cinematic atmosphere and the sound of the fountain whispering in the background, Phoebe felt she had finally found someone who understood her in all her complexities. But of course, life had other plans for their carefully negotiated happiness. The universe, it seemed, had a sense of dramatic timing that would have impressed even the most seasoned romance novelist. The following morning, Connor Silver appeared at Phoebe's downtown office without appointment or warning, dressed in the kind of perfectly tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than her monthly rent, and carrying himself with the predatory confidence of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted through sheer force of personality and family connections. "Miss Barrett, I presume?" he said, settling into the client chair across from her desk without waiting for an invitation. "I'm Connor Silver, Julian's older brother and, depending on who you ask, either his biggest supporter or his greatest obstacle to achieving his full potential." Phoebe set down her coffee and studied him with the careful attention she'd learned to apply to potential clients who might not have her best interests at heart. Where Julian carried himself with thoughtful reserve and genuine humility, Connor radiated the kind of aggressive charm that successful salespeople developed when they'd learned to treat personal interactions as opportunities for strategic advancement. "What can I do for you, Mr. Silver?" "Actually, I'm here to do something for you, something my brother should have done weeks ago, but Julian has always had difficulty with full disclosure when it comes to personal matters that might affect his professional relationships." "I'm not sure I understand what you're implying." Connor smiled, the expression managing to be both charming and vaguely threatening. "I'm suggesting that Julian hasn't been entirely forthcoming about certain aspects of his personal history that might be relevant to a sophisticated woman like yourself, who's considering whether to invest her time and emotional energy in a relationship with him." Phoebe felt a cold knot forming in her stomach, though she kept her expression carefully neutral. "Such as?" "Such as the fact that my brother, at 33 years old, has never had what most people would consider a serious romantic relationship. Not because he lacks opportunities Wealthy, reasonably attractive men rarely struggle to find female companionship, but because he has certain psychological complexities that have prevented him from forming normal adult attachments. Define normal adult attachments. Julian is a virgin, Miss Barrett, and not due to religious convictions or lack of interest in women, but because he's spent his entire adult life paralyzed by social anxiety, perfectionist tendencies, and an almost pathological fear of emotional vulnerability. Connor leaned forward slightly, his voice taking on a tone of false concern. Now, I'm not suggesting there's anything inherently wrong with inexperience, but I thought you deserved to know what you're getting involved with before you invest too heavily in someone who may not be capable of meeting your needs as a grown woman. The information hit Phoebe like a physical blow, not because Julian's virginity was inherently problematic, but because he hadn't shared something so significant about himself when they'd established honesty as the foundation of their relationship. More disturbing was the malicious pleasure she could detect in Connor's delivery, as if he was enjoying the opportunity to destabilize his brother's happiness. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, her voice carefully controlled. "What's your interest in sabotaging your brother's personal life?" "I'm not sabotaging anything. In providing information that allows you to make informed decisions. Julian needs professional help, not a romantic relationship with someone who deserves a partner capable of emotional reciprocity." Connor stood, smoothing his suit jacket with practiced precision. "You strike me as a woman who values honesty and emotional maturity in her relationships. I thought you should know whether Julian is capable of providing either." After Connor left, trailing expensive cologne and toxic implications, Phoebe sat in her office, trying to process the conversation and its potential impact on everything she and Julian had been building together. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Julian. "Can we talk? I know Connor came to see you, and I can explain everything. Meet me at Cranky's Coffee in an hour," she typed back, choosing the busy downtown coffee shop because she needed the safety of a public space to have what was likely to be a difficult conversation about trust, honesty, and the things people choose to reveal or conceal about themselves when they're falling in love. Therefore, as she headed to the meeting, Phoebe wondered if total honesty was really possible in relationships, or if everyone kept secrets that could destroy everything they were building together. But she also wondered why the hell Connor Silver had so much interest in sabotaging his own brother's happiness. Epilogue. 6 months later, the Reynolda House Museum of American Art was hosting a special exhibition titled Unexpected Connections, a collective show that celebrated chance encounters that changed lives, relationships that challenged conventions, and love stories that began in the most unlikely places. Phoebe and Julian were there not just as nostalgic visitors, but as part of the gallery's own history. "Remember when you spilled rosé wine on my very expensive white shirt?" asked Julian, observing the painting Human Touch where they met, now with a small explanatory plaque that mentioned the special connection the work had inspired. "I remember when you had the courage to ask me for coffee, even though you're introverted and full of quirks," Phoebe retorted, adjusting his tie with the intimacy of someone who already knew all his anxiety rituals. "Quirks? I prefer to call them charming peculiarities." "Sure, like reorganizing honey jars alphabetically or playing piano at 3 in the morning when you're worried." "Hey, you said you liked the piano at 3 in the morning." "I do. Especially when you play that song you composed for me." Much had changed since that tense conversation at the Square Cafe, when Phoebe confronted Julian about Connor's malicious revelation. The discussion had been intense, painful, but fundamentally transformative. Julian explained his reasons for maintaining his virginity, a combination of social anxiety, impossibly high self-imposed standards, and a deep fear of emotional intimacy that had been aggravated by his family's toxic dynamics. "It wasn't about you," he had explained with tears in his eyes. "It was about fear of not being enough, of disappointing, of being judged. I wanted to tell you, but didn't know how without sounding pathetic. Do you think I would care about that? I was afraid you would. Most women would care." I'm not most women, Julian, and you're definitely not most men. The conversation had lasted hours, with Phoebe helping him reframe his experience not as an embarrassing limitation, but as a conscious choice that said a lot about his careful character and his search for genuine connections. Together, they had navigated their first time with a tenderness and patience that transformed what could have been anxious into something deeply intimate and revealing. Julian had also overcome much of his social anxiety, especially after Phoebe encouraged him to start therapy and helped him practice social skills in controlled environments. His first public speech about business sustainability had been a resounding success, even with trembling hands and an initially hesitant voice. They had navigated together through the scandal Connor tried to create when he leaked personal information about Julian to local tabloids in a desperate attempt to demoralize him and take control of the company. The strategy backfired when public opinion turned against Connor, seeing him as cruel and manipulative, while Julian gained admiration for his authenticity and vulnerability. The Essence line had been launched with resounding success, revolutionizing the popular cosmetics market in North Carolina and creating a business model that other companies began to copy. Phoebe now ran her own agency, Authentic Connections, specializing in brands with real social impact, and had become a reference in sustainable marketing in the region. Pepper had become the unofficial mascot of Connor Naturals after invading a product launch livestream, walking majestically across the table while Julian tried to explain the benefits of an antioxidant serum. The video went viral, with Pepper being nicknamed the CEO Cat and generating a spontaneous advertising campaign that increased sales by 40%. "Do you think it would have worked if we had met in a different way?" asked Phoebe, observing other couples at the exhibition, all with their own stories of unlikely encounters. "Impossible to know, but I like to think the universe threw us at each other exactly when we needed to learn that true love isn't about perfection, but about genuine acceptance." "How romantic and philosophical, Connor. I learned from the best, Barrett." Mrs. Dorothy, who had become a great fan of Julian after discovering he not only tolerated her endless stories about soap operas, but genuinely found them interesting, approached with Emma and Marcus in tow. "When are you two getting married?" she asked, without beating around the bush, as always. "I'm not getting any younger, and I want to see great-grandchildren before I meet my maker." "Dorothy!" protested Emma, although she was clearly curious about the answer. "What? Someone has to speak the truth. You practically live together, work together. Even that impossible cat approved of you both. What are you waiting for?" Julian and Phoebe looked at each other and laughed, a silent communication that spoke of intimacy, built through months of mutual growth, overcome challenges, and love that had deepened beyond initial attraction. "Soon, Mrs. Dorothy," promised Julian, discreetly touching the small ring in his jacket pocket, the ring that had belonged to his paternal grandmother, redesigned with sustainable stones, and that he planned to offer Phoebe that very night. Very soon, Phoebe noticed the gesture, as she always noticed his small nervousness, and smiled in a way that made Julian's heart race, even after so many months together. Marcus, who had become an integral part of their social circle and was now the official image consultant for Connor Naturals, didn't miss the opportunity to be dramatic. "Guys, if you don't invite me to be the best man, I'll crash the wedding with a performance of I Will Survive that will go viral for all the wrong reasons." "You'll be the best man, Marcus," Phoebe assured, "and you can choose the music." As they observed the exhibition, with Pepper majestically installed in Julian's lap, as if it were her personal throne, and surrounded by the extended family they had built together, including Dorothy, who had revealed herself to be the true guardian of the Silver family secrets, and now protected them like beloved grandchildren, Phoebe realized that her uncompromising desire had been all along for a connection that respected who she really was. And she had found much more than that. She had found a partner who not only accepted her complexities, but celebrated them. Someone who grew alongside her instead of trying to mold her. A person who understood that true love isn't about two halves completing each other, but about two whole people choosing to share their lives. Julian, in turn, had discovered that vulnerability wasn't weakness, but courage. That authenticity attracted much more interesting people than a perfect facade. And that genuine love not only tolerated his peculiarities, but transformed them into endearing characteristics. "You know what?" said Phoebe, observing a young artist explaining her work to an interested group. "I think my father would be proud." "Why?" "Because I managed to mix art, business and love without losing my essence. And because I found someone who understands that relationships are also works of art. They require patience, creativity, and a lot of honesty." "And bees," added Julian seriously. "Relationships definitely benefit from bees." Phoebe laughed, kissing him softly while Pepper observed with feline approval and knew she had found not just her great love, but her partner for a lifetime of adventures, growth, and discoveries. It happened. Therefore, sometimes spilling wine on the right person really can be the best accident of your life. And sometimes the most unlikely love is exactly what you've always been looking for, even without knowing it.